Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Lougheed, Executive Director of the Georgian Bay Land Trust, and it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you here to our third 2020 LandMark Speakers event. We're delighted to have today eminent ecologist Dan Kraus with us. But before introducing Dan, I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in and thank each one of you for your support of GBLT's conservation work. I also want to thank Mark Payne and Payne Marine for sponsoring this great series. Payne Marine has been serving the Point of Barrel area since 1961 as a supplier of Yamaha outboards and Scott Hunt and limestone boats. So I hope you'll visit his site at paynemarine.com. Although these are challenging times, I'm inclined to look for a silver lining at times like these. This past pandemic has reminded us of the importance of family, of community, of relationships, and of the outdoors. It has shone a spotlight on where our food comes from and the importance of nature in supplying that. In these uncertain times, wild places like Georgian Bay remain in place. These are areas we can go to always, as long as we always look after them. I also want to take a moment to let you know that your commitment to conservation as a GBLT supporter is making an impact not just today, but for future generations. Let's just take a quick look at the impact your support provided in 2019. Together, we added 4 new conservation reserves, bringing our total of 61 reserves up to an acreage of over 7,300. And we're working on 3 new important nature reserves in 2020, including a 290-acre public accessible educational nature reserve on Rose Island, supported by the federal government and wonderful donors such as you. We've launched a partnership last year with a large collective grant for Georgian Bay Biosphere Reserve, Magnetawan and Shawanaga First Nations, and this 4-year collaborative project to protect and recover species at risk throughout our biosphere and Eco District 5E7. GBLT's work will map critical habitats and corridors for species at risk and provide a living mapping system for the archipelago and our eastern coast for decades to come. We are the lead on that. We're also rapidly expanding our remote telemetry stations for migratory birds and allowing scientists to study bird behavior and what threats there are to their viability. The conservation planning work that you help fund will inform all stakeholders and identify important and conservation ranked habitats for species at risk and how everyone can help preserve the viability of our native species for decades to come. So now I'm very excited to introduce to you Dan Kraus, Senior Conservation Biologist with the Nature Conservancy of Canada. Dan is an expert on the Great Lakes and is a co-author of Biodiversity Conservation Strategies for all Canadian Great Lakes. His numerous and distinguished publications include Islands of Life, the Great Lakes Islands Conservation and Biodiversity Atlas, and Islands of Green, which is a primer to enable others to design community-based nature reserves. Really important seminal works. Dan is an expert on Canadian rare species, landscape ecology, and connectivity with high-level knowledge of wetland, prairie, and coastal habitats. He sits on the International Union for the Conservation of Nature Species Survival Commission and the Committee on the Status of Species at Risk for Ontario. Dan, I'm delighted to introduce you, and we look forward to your very, very exciting talk.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Bill. It's a pleasure to virtually see you and some of my friends at GBLT. Just going to try to get my slides set up here. Bill or Sarah, could you just let me know if you can see my screen? Okay, great. Thank you very much. Well, Georgian Bay holds a special place in my heart. Well, at Nature Conservancy of Canada, I've done a couple conservation plans that involve Georgian Bay. And like many parts of Canada, really became to appreciate them much more when I started talking to Americans and looking at our planet from a more global perspective. As a kid, I spent a lot of time on Georgian Bay and really just kind of thought, that's Georgian Bay. And wasn't really until I was a conservation biologist at Nature Conservancy of Canada and doing some of those Great Lakes plans that Bill mentioned, that I realized that, this is the longest freshwater coastline on the planet, the largest collection of freshwater islands on the planet. And, while sometimes it seems like there's a lot of them. It really is, from a global perspective, quite a unique and special place, and very appreciative of the great work that Georgian Bay Land Trust does in keeping that place safe. I've been with Nature Conservancy of Canada now for about 18 years. And I don't know if it's because of my tenure at the organization or just because I'm getting a little grayer in the beard, but I do think a lot more about the past and just how much things have changed in terms of our perceptions of nature and the need for conservation. When the Nature Conservancy of Canada was founded back in the 1960s, we had half as many people on this planet. Your phone holds more computer power than the world's biggest supercomputers at that time. And we only had grainy images from space of our planet taken from a few satellites that had just been launched. And we only had the first kind of lists of globally endangered species. It really was kind of the birth of the environmental movement. Fast forward 60 years, and I think even the founders of NCC would be really surprised at what's happened. Issues around the environment that used to be local have really catapulted into something that have become global. Our current time is often called the Anthropocene, the age of humans, and it really is an age when we're coming to dominate our planet. About 3/4 of the Earth's terrestrial surface has been directly modified by people, and even in our oceans, almost 90% has been directly impacted by overfishing, too many nutrients in the water, and climate change. And it's climate change I want to talk to you about. Now, I'm a little stressed because I was seeing that poll, and it sounds like global issues are something that people don't want to hear about a little bit less. But I promise you, I'm going to bring it back to Georgian Bay and how climate change is affecting this incredible collection of freshwater coastline and islands. But hopefully, at the end of my talk, there'll just be 4 things that if you can take away, I'll be happy. A little bit about how climate change is happening now, just a bit of the science around that. A few facts about how climate change is impacting nature and people. I hope you gain a bit of an understanding about the important role that nature plays in storing carbon and helping to buffer both people and nature against some of the impacts of climate change that we're already seeing. And finally, and I think the most important one, just the absolutely critical role that nature has in helping both nature, biodiversity, but also us adapt to the changes that are happening right now. And this climate change and biodiversity loss, they really are kind of the twin crises that are happening right now on our planet. And fortunately, the solutions for them do go together. And a lot of that work can be around conserving land. So just some quick basic science. We have more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere now than any human has ever experienced in the past. This graph is showing the amount of carbon dioxide over the past 800,000 years. And you can see it's just skyrocketed very, very quickly since the Industrial Revolution. Now, we tend to think most of this carbon comes from burning fossil fuels, and that's certainly a major component. But the other thing is land use. I mentioned how we've modified a huge area of the Earth's terrestrial ecosystems. And so what were carbon sinks, what were holding carbon, have become carbon sources. So all that carbon that was locked up in wetlands and forests has been released. And that's part of the reason why this has gone up so quickly. I like to think about it a little bit as, kind of being in your car with the windows. What that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere does is it lets solar radiation comes in, but it traps heat. And you'll know if you sit in your car, you have the windows open, that solar radiation that comes in, much of that heat can escape. But as you start doing the windows up, which is equivalent to increasing the amount of carbon dioxide, more and more of that heat is trapped. And we know that the world is getting warmer. There's no question and no debate about that. On average, the global temperature has gone up about 0.85 degrees around the planet. But what's really important to remember is that this is not even around the planet. So here in Canada, it's actually gone up about double the global average, so 1.7 degrees. And even within Canada, this is not even. So where we are in Southern Ontario, we're about the global average. It's gone up on average about 1 degree. But in many parts of Canada, like my brother lives in Yellowknife, in that really, really dark area in northwestern Canada, it's actually gone up like about 3 degrees on average. So it's affecting our country differently in terms of the rate and the amount of temperature change that has occurred. Now, of course, it's not all about rising temperatures. When we start to heat things up, other things start to happen, particularly around water. And what we're seeing now is that we're having more extreme storm events. What was the 100-year storm event is now often the 5-year storm event, the 2-year storm event. That's because all that heat just has the potential to create these massive thunderstorm activities. And we've had many cases where like a month's worth of rain gets dropped in one rainfall event in a very, very short period of time. So many of the effects that we're feeling around climate change and that the insurance companies are watching very closely are how it's affecting water. A couple other things that are happening: oceans are becoming more acidic. Much of that carbon dioxide that we've released into the atmosphere has been absorbed by the oceans, but as a result, that's made them more acidic. And also sea levels are rising. So sea levels have gone up about 17 centimeters, and that's partly because of things like melting ice caps, so they're contributing to that water. But also, as the oceans warm a little bit, there's a bit of expansion. And it's not much, but when you're a whole ocean, just that little bit of expansion can actually increase the amount of sea level. And then finally, as Canadians, we should be aware about our sea ice. A huge amount of our country is covered with sea ice, some of which persists into the summer. It's critical habitat for things like polar bears, for seals. There's whole marine ecosystems that rely on the sea ice. And that sea ice is disappearing at a rate of about 7% per decade since the late 1960s. So things are changing quite quickly. I think it's important to recognize that nature is very adaptable. Nature's gone through lots of changes, but really what the critical issue is now, it's the rate of change that things are happening, which is making it very difficult for both people, but also nature to adapt. But fortunately, there are things that we can do about this. I just want to talk a little bit about the Great Lakes. Certainly, we're seeing a decline in ice coverage in the Great Lakes. This measure only goes back until kind of the mid 1970s, but we are seeing a decline in the amount of ice on the Great Lakes. We certainly have periods like in 2019 or 2014 where we had a lot of ice, but we're increasingly seeing years like 2002 or 2017 or just this past winter where we don't have a lot of ice on the Great Lakes. That has a bunch of different effects. It doesn't just affect snowmobiling. It also means that the lakes tend to warm up a little more quickly in the springtime, which can affect spawning of some fishes. It also means that during the winter, we can get a lot more snow because when the lakes are not covered with ice, you have all of this water, and as cold wind blows across them, you actually create this amazing snowmaking machine like Buffalo often experiences. So that might mean that with climate change, we're actually going to see more snowfall, which then could mean more runoff and more flooding in the spring potentially. People often ask me about water levels in the Great Lakes and climate change. I think the verdict is still out. The Great Lakes do go through long-term changes in water levels. Lows that we had, now we're at the opposite end of the scale. There may be a role of climate change, but that really hasn't been pulled out yet at this point. So how is this affecting nature and people? I mentioned a few things. I want to talk a little bit about nature. Globally, one of the classic examples are species like this little American pika, which lives in Canada in mountain areas. And as temperatures rise, it can kind of adapt a little bit by sort of moving up the mountain to find sort of optimal climate or the vegetation that it needs. But eventually it's a species that it'll run out of mountain as it kind of keeps going up. In the Georgian Bay area, there's been some recent studies about a couple species that are found and how climate change might be affecting them. Bumblebees are declining around the world, and in Canada, a recent paper came out saying that climate change might be affecting them. And what it is, it's the number of very, very hot days that we consecutively have, like we're having right now, that could actually be affecting the ability of bumblebees in terms of their foraging. And it may actually be resulting in local extinctions, which is affecting the global populations. Tree swallows, tree swallows are part of a group of birds that scientists call aerial insectivores. They fly around, they eat insects. Flycatchers are another example, or whippoorwills. And some studies showing that the extreme crazy weather that we have in the spring when they're trying to raise their young may actually be a contributing factor to reduced nesting success that could be impacting their populations. So we're having growing examples of how climate change, be it extreme weather or changing temperatures, are directly affecting some of the plants and animals that live right around us today. There's many direct impacts. Invasive species are one I'm a little worried about. This is a plant called kudzu, sometimes called the plant that ate the South. 10 years ago, I was not worried about kudzu at all because I thought it's way too cold here in Canada for this plant to grow. But it has been found now, and models are showing if we keep having these warmer winter temperatures, this is a plant that could spread. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of ones that could occur in Georgian Bay a little bit later. Fires are another one, something that many of you may have experienced. Now, this is a tricky one because many ecosystems, including some in Georgian Bay, are adapted to fire. Some of the ecosystems and landscapes we have are because of fire. The picture of the tree here is a jack pine. Which you especially get a little bit further north on the bay. It has a very tight cone that's held together by resin, and that's only actually released in extreme heat from fire. So it's a tree that's fire adapted. But what's happening with climate change is that we're getting more extreme dry weather sometimes in the summer. More thunderstorms, can be more lightning strikes. But this is complicated because on the other side of the coin, we've also been putting out a lot of fires for a very long time, resulting in a buildup of fuel load. So when you combine a century of fire suppression that's built up fuel load, along with maybe drier weather and more lightning strikes, we are going to see more fires in landscapes, especially fire-prone landscapes like some parts of Georgian Bay and many, many other parts of Canada. And I mentioned how many of the impacts of climate change are going to be felt by us through water. A great example are nutrients that are running into lakes. And I know there's some reports of blue-green algae blooms in even Lake of Bays this year, Lake Muskoka. And these are issues that Lake Erie and Lake Winnipeg have been dealing with for a long time. As with fire, there's lots of other things that are happening in terms of changing land use. But one of the contributing factors probably to algae blooms are the fact that these waters, all of our waters are warmer. And also we're getting these extreme heavy rains that are amazing at flushing nutrients from the land into the water. Those nutrients on land grow trees and crops, but when you put those nutrients into the water, they often grow algae, and you can result in these algae blooms that can be quite harmful to nature and also really degrade our ability to enjoy these waters. Third thing I want you to learn a little bit about is the really critical role that nature has in holding carbon. We often hear about these amazing technologies and funding for new carbon sequestration technologies. And I often kind of shake my head. It's because, we have something that does that. It's self-sustaining, it's solar powered, it's biodegradable, and it's nature. It's something nature has been doing for a very long time. All of the fossil fuels that we burn, be it coal or oil or gas, ultimately that all came from carbon that nature stored for the long term in the ground that we're releasing. It's one of my favorite graphs in the world. Now I want you to look at what this is showing is the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's measured at Mauna Loa in Hawaii, which is a place where scientists thought is as far away from possible you can get from direct emissions of carbon. Also probably a great place if you want to measure carbon dioxide. I don't want you to look at the black line. That's how the average amount of carbon has been going up in our atmosphere every year, and we're now over well over that 400 parts per million. But see that red line, how it goes up and down every year. The reason it goes down every year, what that is, in part, it's our northern forests kind of waking up after winter and breathing in that carbon dioxide and actually can reduce it until the following winter. Now, some of that carbon that those trees and wetlands hold is eventually released through decomposition or through respiration, but some of it is held. Scientists can even measure which ecosystems hold the most amount of carbon. And Canada really plays a critical role in this. Canada has probably the largest storehouse of terrestrial carbon anywhere in the planet. And much of this is held in wetlands, in our peatlands, including many of the ones around Georgian Bay. So especially these peatlands where as plant material drops into water, there's low oxygen, it tends not to decompose very well. If you were to paddle out to this area and stick your hand into that muck and pull it up, you'd find that there's like little pieces of leaves and twigs. That's amazing carbon storage that's happening in these wetlands right now. And one of the most important things we can do is try to protect these wetlands, because they are not only storing this carbon, but they're also holding that water during extreme storm events. Globally, wetlands like peatlands like this that are very slow in decomposing plant material cover only about 3% of the planet, but they actually store more carbon than all of the forests on the planet combined. They really are a critical ally, not just in protecting nature. I mean, these places have incredible biodiversity, but in holding that carbon that we so desperately want to keep in the ground and not in our atmosphere. We can even start to put a value on some of these services that nature provides in terms of storing carbon. A few years ago, I was involved in a project with TD Bank, which was incredible. It's like ecologists working with economists, but then I thought about it, it's like the root word eco is the same, right? It's about looking after the house. But what we were actually able to do is look at a few properties and actually measure the amount of carbon that they're holding and put a value on that. So this Connect property in Quebec, which is sort of similar to the systems you'd find in Georgian Bay. It's generally on Canadian Shield, lots of wetlands, lots of lakes, lots of forests. Every year, stores thousands and thousands of tons of carbon. And our economist was actually able to put a value on that. And he identified that the forested areas, the wetlands on this property provide ecological services that are worth about $25,000 per hectare per year. So, and if we keep it on the landscape, it'll provide those services forever. So, sometimes I hate putting a dollar value on nature, but in a world where sometimes decisions are really made on economics, it is a good number, a good tool to have in our back pocket, because these places do provide real contributions to the quality of our lives, and also provide us with important benefits that really we can't do without. Final thing I want to talk to you a little bit about is the important role that nature really has in protecting biodiversity, plants and animals, but also people adapt to climate change, and give you a couple examples of what we're doing at Nature Conservancy of Canada. I think one thing that's really important that we do is the way we talk about conservation. I got into nature conservation because I really like plants and animals. Like, I love walking through the woods, looking at plants, preferably by myself. But increasingly, we recognize that not everybody necessarily values nature for these reasons. I look at a system like this and could talk about species at risk and wetlands. That's enough reason for me to protect these places. But we also need to appreciate and to communicate and to value these systems for the benefits that they provide to all people, and be able to change our language and talk about a property that we're protecting, not just because of the species at risk or the globally endangered rock barren habitats it has, but also because of the important benefits it provides to people, and especially through a lens of climate change. So every property that you guys protect, has rare species, provides connectivity, helps to enlarge protected areas, but they also help to store carbon, they help to control floods, provide water security, and are really critical in terms of helping us adapt to climate change. One of my favorite examples at Nature Conservancy of Canada, we've been working at a property called the Minising Wetlands. So if you look on this map, you can see Barrie, Highway 400, probably many of you drive that. Just to the west of that is this incredible wetland that we've been working with Nottawasaga Valley Conservation Area, Ducks Unlimited Canada, and other partners for probably 30 years. So most of this is protected. Probably looks a little bit like the marsh on Highway 400 around Newmarket would have looked like before it was drained. But this is we recently did a project where one of the main things was protecting habitat for this Hines emerald dragonfly. So this is a dragonfly. It's globally rare, only occurs in Ontario, Wisconsin, and Michigan, only recently discovered in Ontario. And now for me, I mean, that's reason enough to write a check, right? But not everybody maybe appreciates the Heinz Emerald Dragonfly or values it the same way I do. But we're also able to talk about the property, the wetland property we want to protect from the perspective of climate change adaptation. It's a wetland property that holds millions and millions of liters of water when we don't want more water in our streams and rivers, reducing flooding downstream, including the places like Wasaga Beach. And by talking about our properties in a slightly different way like that, we're able to kind of engage different people in terms of why this place should be protected, what the benefits will be. In Quebec, we've been able to get provincial money to create wildlife corridors, something that we would have wanted to do anyhow, but have received significant funding to create corridors to help animals and plant communities shift because of climate change. So as I said before, nature is adaptable, but we need to give nature a chance to adapt. And the one thing we can do is to create these corridors. And if anything, climate change is increasing the urgency to make sure, especially in these landscapes that are fragmented or becoming fragmented, that we have this connectivity so that plants and animals are able to shift during this period of change. And then finally, fire is a big one. It's coming up on many of our properties, and it's probably something that in places like Georgian Bay needs to be considered, where we need to actually bring fire back to the landscape. As I said, there's many ecosystems, including like those jack pine barrens, many like red and white pine ecosystems that are fire created and fire dependent. Historically, they would have had many frequent small fires that didn't go into the canopy, but just kind of burned off the fuel load. But we've often created systems now where we end up with these massive catastrophic fires where it burns everything all at once, which is not good for nature and also can impact things like water quality. So reintroducing fire into the landscape, often this is like deep traditional indigenous knowledge. This has been stewardship that's been done by indigenous peoples. And one thing we can do is just try to reconnect and to rediscover that traditional land management that will help to maintain those ecosystems, but also prevent some of those catastrophic fires that we're more likely to see in part because of climate change. And almost everything that we do is around water is really a climate change adaptation strategy. As I said, most of the impacts that we're going to experience and we are experiencing around climate change are going to be around water. And we really need to re-examine and to renew our relationship with water. For 2 centuries, we've been trying to get water off of the landscape as quick as we possibly can. We need to shift that around to where we try to hold water on the landscape as much as we can. And we can do that through natural systems, be it forests or wetlands, and that's critical. So a couple of things around Georgian Bay and what can be done as climate change adaptation strategies. A lot of these are things that you guys are already doing. Conserving and connecting is absolutely critical. And I know that you guys are working on kind of keeping a corridor along this world's largest freshwater archipelago. That connectivity is important because as temperatures change, as conditions change, species kind of need that room to be able to find those environments where they can persist into the future. And by conserving key areas, we may be conserving key areas that scientists sometimes call refugia. So it may be that the temperature is changing, but there might be pockets. Sometimes these are north-facing places that are a little bit cooler. Sometimes these are really large, intact forests where species will be able to persist within those systems. So protecting those refugia is important as well. Monitoring for invasive species is critical. This is sort of one of the indirect impacts of climate change. Things like, I'm sure most people are familiar with European common reed or Phragmites. It may have come into Georgian Bay anyhow, but climate change is something that can certainly help. It's also related to extreme weather events as well, because you have it growing along ditches and you get a ton of rain and all that frag material, including like live rhizomes, can get washed into waterways, and that's one way it's dispersed. There are also ones that aren't really established yet, but are kind of emerging. Japanese knotweed is one that really scares me. It never used to scare me. I didn't like it before, but now it scares me. And that's because I was in Halifax a few years ago, and it's everywhere. And Halifax is not that different than the Canadian Shield in many places. And there it's invaded waterways and shorelines and moved through forests. And I'm just afraid this is one, which does occur in little pockets in Georgian Bay, that just suddenly it could kind of be released. We've seen that before with things like dog strangling vine, where it was sort of, you know, I don't want to say well-behaved, but it was just kind of, you know, there, and then all of a sudden, boom, it takes off and it goes all over the place. So this monitoring of invasive species is critical, and it's really a great opportunity for everybody to be involved, because using apps, you can see all these pictures are from iNaturalist. It's a great way to have, you know, hundreds of people out there that are monitoring for these species, and we can kind of tag where they are and hopefully do some early detection and eradication to manage them. Leveraging climate change adaptation for conservation. So, I mean, all of the land protection that we do, as I said, we can kind of put it through a climate change lens. The other one I want to talk about, though, is connectivity for fishes. This map on the left was part of an indicator that we helped develop for the Great Lakes that looked at connectivity for fish from the Great Lakes into streams. Most of that area in the red in the Great Lakes watershed at one time was connected to the waters of the Great Lakes, but because of dams and other barriers, large areas have been cut off. What we can all do though, is look for some of these small breaks in connectivity around road stream crossings. So the reason I have a picture of the culvert is that there are thousands of places, probably thousands in Georgian Bay, where there's a road that crosses a stream and they just kind of plop the culvert on, and you end up with this nice little waterfall, which is great. But if you're a fish, that's a dead end if you're coming upstream. This is a great opportunity as municipalities are looking at replacing culverts for climate change adaptation, because this culvert was put in when the 100-year storm was thought to be something that doesn't occur anymore. So they're putting bigger culverts in to make sure that they're putting them in a way that also increases connectivity. So fishes like suckers and all these things that are important bait fishes for many of the game fish that we like to catch have access to more spawning habitat. And finally, reducing other threats to wildlife. You know, climate change is not going to destroy all of nature. The major threat to biodiversity in Canada remains habitat loss. And by reducing habitat loss, by doing things like reducing, you know, direct mortality to species like this globally endangered eastern fox snake, that probably Georgian Bay is the best spot in the world to conserve them, we can reduce those other threats, which will help to give them an opportunity to adapt to climate change, so that they'll still have robust, diverse populations. There'll be many occurrences, and that's absolutely critical for helping these plants and animals adapt to our changing world. So I just wanted to say, you know, in conclusion, you know, climate change is it's a major impact, it's a global impact, but there are things that we can do to do about it. But one of the most critical things we can do is to protect nature. And I challenge you to think of any protected area that was protected 50 years, 100 years ago, and nobody regrets that conservation today. Nobody, you know, looks back at places like Algonquin Park or Georgian Bay Islands National Parks and thinks, you know, that's a shame they protected that. So the work that we're doing now, protecting places like Rose Island, which I know you're working on right now, these are places that are critical for protecting nature today, but the amount they're going to be appreciated and the amount they're going to be needed by future generations really is essential. So as I said, you know, I kind of got into conservation because I thought about plants and animals, but really the work that we're doing is protecting, you know, our well-being and the stability of our society for generations to come. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dan. That was wonderful. I'm going to turn it over to Janet here for some closing remarks, but then we'll come back for questions. So if anyone has questions for Dan, please feel free to type them in the chat box, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen, and then we will deal with those in a moment.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Dan. That was very fascinating. You know, as I make my way around the Bay this summer, I am struck by the number of nature stories I'm hearing, from more than usual activity of all species to new and different sightings of reptiles in expected habitats and others not so much. But one thing that's very clear is that Mother Nature in all her glory is what makes this coastline so special. And that is why we will continue to protect this wilderness place forever. The GBLT continues our important conservation work. Our properties, our green properties are all open now. So all visitors must abide by the current health guidelines of social distancing and crowd size. It's so nice to see so many familiar faces here this morning. And we know that this is an extraordinary time and the demand on your resources is unprecedented, but our work continues. And so we hope that we can count on you today to make your donation to the GBLT now. Our next Landmark Speaker Series is next on Saturday, August 8th with Dr. Ryan Norris. He's talking about Canada jays in Algonquin Park. And then Pat Chow-Fraser is back with us on August 15th, Turtle Talk for Kids. Both of these require you to register online so that we can give you the link. So please visit our website and do so. I just want to thank everyone for joining us this morning. If you're on the Bay, it's a glorious day. If you're not here on the Bay, we miss you. I know there are a lot of Americans who may be watching today, and it's not the same without you. So thank you, everybody, and back to Dan and Sarah for questions.
Thanks, Janet. So if you have questions for Dan, please type them in the chat. I'm not seeing any at the moment, and I'm just not sure if that's because there aren't any or if there's something with the, oh, here we go. Okay, great. So first question from Erin is, she's wondering if you're able to speak to any specific ways that the Georgian Bay Land Trust is working alongside Indigenous partners. Okay, so that would be more of a question for us. Bill, do you want to answer that, or would you like me to?
Sure, I can answer that. We have a grant with the Georgian Bay Biosphere Reserve that it also includes as co-partners Shawanaga First Nations and Wasauksing and Magnetawan First Nations. It's probably going to incorporate more of them. And we're working alongside on that grant with those First Nations to basically bring together Western approaches to conservation with traditional ecological knowledge of First Nations. We're also working along, I'm personally working alongside those First Nations with their management plans for their versions approaches to conservation mapping and new approaches to conserving unfragmented landscapes, because most of the tools out there are for fragmented landscapes. So we've developed new approaches to that is finishing up in August. And at that time, then the First Nations and our mapping experts, including myself, will be integrating the traditional knowledges and approaches to conservation, and that mapping will then be a mix of First Nations and Western approaches to conservation mapping that will inform all stakeholders on Georgian Bay. The other things we're doing on that, working with First Nations, is identification of inland Phragmites sites and removal of those Phragmites. We're doing drone flying. They're being taught how to fly drones later on this year or perhaps next year to survey their wetlands for Phragmites. We're then going to be loading all that information up into the Parry Sound Geographical Network, so everyone, including First Nations, will have access to that that conservation data. Whether it's we're also doing alongside work and collaborative work. We meet every month with them in terms of doing species at risk inventorying, mapping those, and that mapping will become live again on the Parry Sound WSPN Geographical Network. And GBLT was also asked to help out with veg community mapping on Shawanaga Island. And so that's apparently going to happen in July. And this goes back, I think, to work that Dan Kraus did, and Yarmo Yalava, I believe. There was mapping done on there in the early 2000s. We're going back to remap it, and that will help with them with basically their whole planning on a grant that they have from the government of Canada. So those are some of the things that we're doing with First Nations. Sorry, Dan.
Thanks, Bill. Okay, so a question for Dan. Dan, Dawn is wondering, what kind of impact have you seen in your experience, or do you think citizen science can have on helping protect the places we love?
Yeah, I think the emergence of the citizen science apps is one of the most exciting things that's happened in conservation, because suddenly we can all make new discoveries. We can all kind of mount our own expeditions to islands or places that haven't been inventoried before, and share that information with people from around the world, including scientists. So I think the two things it's helping with the most right now is understanding the distribution and numbers of species at risk. So by taking your phone and using things like iNaturalist, there's been all kinds of new discoveries about the ranges, the numbers, even the habitats of different species at risk. And then the other one is invasive species. The most important thing we can do with invasive species is early detection and eradication. And just learn how to identify 1, 2, or 3 of what are likely to be the most problematic invasive species in the bay. And again, you can put those records onto iNaturalist. Because suddenly, I mean, not only do we have a lot more people collecting data, but everyone's involved then. And just like things like the Lake Partnership Program that collects data on water quality, it's great to have scientists from government agencies or other places and universities involved, but I think the more that we're directly involved in collecting information, sharing information, and acting on information, that's really when conservation comes to life. It's when it's that community that's actually doing much of the action and doing that monitoring.
Great, thanks. Another question from Stephen. He says he's having lots of high water die off of plants around the shoreline due to the high water on Georgian Bay this year. And he's heard that we should be removing this material because it'll put nutrients in the water. He's wondering if that's true, or should we be leaving it around the shoreline?
Yeah, I would leave it. I mean, this process of lake levels going up and down and plant material or plants, either drying out or flooding is something that's been going on for thousands of years. In general, I mean, most of Lake Huron is like phosphorus is not a huge issue. Leaving that plant material too, I mean, provides habitat. That those plant materials provide habitat for insects, insects that scientists sometimes call shredders. It will kind of eat all of that leaf material. So even though it's in the water, a lot of it doesn't end up in the water. It gets turned into caddisflies and mayflies. It gets turned into swallows and whippoorwills. So I would just leave it in the water.
All right, thanks. Janet's wondering, aside from supporting the Georgian Bay Land Trust, what can individual cottagers do about climate change?
Yeah, that's sort of the big question. What can we do? I think it is important that we recognize that there are changes that are happening now that are really going to be irreversible. So things like sea level rise, even rising temperatures. If we were to shut off the amount of CO2 that we're putting into the atmosphere right now, a lot of those changes are going to happen. I think one of the most important things we can do is to be hopeful. We've sort of gone through this before. I'm old enough, I remember acid rain. I can remember going to Algonquin Park and being told that by the time I'm growing up, there's going to be no fish because of acid rain. That problem got solved. I can remember thinking I was sure I was going to die of skin cancer because of the hole in the ozone layer, that we've kind of managed to solve that. Certainly climate change is a much bigger issue in terms of the global scale of it. But But as we've seen with COVID, people can actually respond very quickly once we realize the impact of the crisis. And I think we are at kind of this turning point right now in terms of reimagining and hopefully recreating a different world that's going to be better for nature and better for people.
All right, we've got a more specific question from Rolf here, wondering if the current heat spike out west is associated with gas and oil extraction, or are there other factors contributing to that?
There's no question that Western Canada is getting warmer more faster, at a faster rate than many other places in the country. So it's very, very likely that many parts of Western Canada, including some places that are farmed right now, are going to be experiencing more and more drought conditions. So it's not directly because of that specific activity, but it is one of these consequences of living in a warmer and less certain climate.
All right, and then we've got a couple of questions, again, Georgian Bay specific, about protecting loons and turtles. Whether there's anything cottagers can do, like protecting turtle nests or building loon nest boxes, or anything we can do to protect those beloved species.
Yeah, I mean, those are both great things that you just mentioned. Trying to reduce boat traffic around areas that loons nest is critical. It's another great activity for citizen science as well, being able to record the locations of where turtles are. One thing that we sometimes don't think about is around road mortality with turtles, but the other side of that is around nest predation. So there's things we can do around roads to try to reduce the number of female turtles that are run over, but we can also try to reduce the number of things like cats that will actually dig up turtle nests and eat turtles. So, if you do bring your cat to the cottage, I know it's hard, but try to keep the cat inside. Even things like making sure raccoons and stuff aren't getting in your garbage. I mean, it's a pain because they're getting in your garbage, but increasingly we're recognizing that humans are subsidizing some of these predators by giving them food, like our garbage. And raccoons can be a major source of mortality in digging up turtle nests. The other great thing I've seen recently are people putting these turtle nest protectors on. So these are like little cages. If you just Google turtle nest protector, I think actually Lee Valley sells a kit. It's basically a thing you put over the nest, you put some big spikes in to keep it down so raccoons can't lift it up. And when the hatchlings come out, there's just little escape hatches they can get through. So that's another great one as well. And I think we do need more work in terms of figuring out where some of these turtles are nesting. Often there's like very high concentrations of things like map turtles. If there's a nice sandy beach, a lot of them will come to those areas. And for some species, if they seem to be declining, things like head starting. There's been some great examples of southern Ontario where with Blanding's turtle and softshell turtle, they actually collect the eggs, hatch them, and then release the hatchlings. Hopefully in Georgian Bay, we're like not to that point because there still is sort of good recruitment, but that's something that if some of these populations seem to be declining, that can be done.
All right, thanks. And just one final question here. I'm not sure whether you'll have the answer to this, but someone's wondering whether it's true that Lake Huron is warmer this summer than ever before.
Well, I guess we'll need to wait till the end of the summer to make that call. Certainly the number of days over 30 degrees that we've had, I think is unprecedented. I think the 1930s, there was a period like this as well. But I'd encourage you to go to, it was just released, the State of the Great Lakes report that will actually, that talks about lake temperatures. And there are groups like in the US to actually like track those temperatures. So you can access that data and just kind of see what's been happening.
Great, thanks so much. I think that's the end of our questions. There's lots of messages here thanking you, Dan, for your great presentation. And I'd like to say that as well. Thank you so much. This has been a really great morning. And thanks everyone for joining us. All right, bye everyone.
Thank you, Dan. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.